Before we start the show, Andy, I'd just like to say a quick thank you to our podcast sponsor, Wealthsimple, one of the leading online investment platforms globally. Now, Wealthsimple manages over £3 billion for more than 200,000 customers. Wealthsimple prides itself on providing access to smart, simple investing without the high fees and account minimums usually associated with traditional investment management. In fact, you can open a stocks and shares ISA, a SIP or a junior ISA with as little as £1, which is far lower than any of its peers, and every client has access to unlimited human advice from a qualified investment advisor. Now, Wealthsimple also provides ethical investing options and produces an online magazine in an attempt to demystify the world of money. Money to the Masses podcast listeners can get their first £10,000 with Wealthsimple managed free for a year if they sign up at wealthsimple.com/money to the masses. You can also check our full review of Wealthsimple online at moneytothemasses.com.
Hello and welcome to episode 274 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay and me, Andy Leakes. Damien, welcome back. How you doing?
I'm good. Really good, Andy. It's good to be back another week. We're recording this on a Friday, and we're obviously we're very remote, aren't we? So me and you aren't in the same place, but we've been sharing a lot of what's going on in your life, haven't we, Andy? Which is quite funny because anyone who follows us on social media will know that Andy has a new arrival, don't you?
It's been a busy week this week, and as all new parents know, it's a really nervous time building up to this sort of thing. You know, months of preparation. Have you got the right stuff? Have you got the room ready? Of course, you all know what I'm talking about. We've got a new puppy. So, no, it's not a surprise pregnancy. I haven't kept that from all the listeners, but there is a new puppy in the house. And it's interesting times. It is almost like looking after a baby again and getting all those routines sorted, toileting, that kind of thing. But it's been super fun. And like you say, Damien, we've shared some pictures on the socials as well. And the feedback we're getting is little Lola is pretty cute.
Yeah, little Lola is more popular than us, so incredibly cute. Only disappointment, we need more pictures and more video because we've got a few from when obviously she first arrived. So we will share more. It's funny, you put a pet on any type of social media and it's incredibly popular. In fact, if you go onto our Instagram, there is a Money to the Masses pet highlight where people in the community, the Facebook community, sent pictures of their pets. So if you have pictures of pets, we love seeing them. We'll add Andy's Lola to the highlight on Instagram for pets. But exciting, Andy, isn't it? She's the tiniest thing I think I've ever seen.
She is the tiniest thing indeed. She's just literally about the length of my foot. So she's 8 weeks old.
What is she?
She's a mini Schnauzer puppy. And causing us. The reason I haven't sent more pictures and videos is I don't want to be that sort of keen parent, you know, that keeps pushing their little bundle of joy on other people. So now that you've asked for it, I will send more. So there we go.
Yeah, so that was the highlight of Money to the Masses this week. So we'll share more of Lola just because it brings a little ray of sunshine into the world at the moment. But moving on from dogs, this isn't a dog podcast. This is a money podcast. I'll let you into what we're going to talk about this week, Andy, as you have no idea because we haven't actually spoken that much this week because Andy, fairness to him, it's Andy's week off. He's taken a week's holiday for Money to the Masses, but he insisted that he wanted to do the podcast and he wants to edit the podcast. There you go. I mean, if I had access to a round of applause, Andy, I would give you one. But I don't control the editing. So, yeah, Andy's on the podcast through his own desire.
Well, as I said to you, Damien, I don't see the podcast as work. I really enjoy chatting to you each week. And the podcast was born from many years ago where you and I were just chatting and hoping that we could spread some wisdom out there. And it's no different. I need to get away from the children from time to time. And for me, this is perfect for us to catch up. So, I mean, there's your brutal honesty right there.
Yeah.
So, Damien, moving on. What have we got coming up on this week?
Right, on the podcast this week, I'm going to do a piece about inflation. And it's really a thought piece that will probably open people's eyes a bit about the importance of inflation. If you know what inflation is, don't just switch off because it's a piece that will hopefully make you think slightly differently about your own money and about the way that you manage it going forward. The next piece, I'm going to talk a bit about an article actually that I read that really is a kind of a focus on the FIRE movement, you know, the Financial Independence Retire Early movement. And it was an article that I read on an American website that was about a chap who retired at the age of 35 with $1 million and was traveling the world. And it was how he did it. And I want to just briefly go through that. And the final piece is just a bit of an FYI for people who are renting. They might be able to get some money back, which would be a positive for those people out there, especially in this current environment.
Perfect. So what are we going to start with?
So let's start with inflation. Now, inflation is just a measure of the increase in prices over time. Now, we all tend to witness this, even if we don't label it as inflation. So when we go to the shops, we notice prices rise over time. House prices also increase. A lot of that is down to inflation. It's that sort of supply and demand. So the amount of assets that exist in an economy for certain things can be fairly fixed at times. And then the money that's chasing after it will often increase, and demand will increase, and it'll push the price up. So that is just what happens over time. Things start to increase in price, and we notice it. We suddenly, if you've got children, a recent example, the Tooth Fairy now charges about somewhere between £1 and £2, it seems to me, or delivers £1 or £2, which is way more than the sort of 10p, 20p I used to get. So that's inflation.
I love the way as well you changed the phrasing from charges to pays, or whatever, however you did that. That was good.
I know. It's just in case we have any children listening who still are losing their teeth. But yeah, we end up providing a certain amount of money for teeth that arrive, and that's gone up, and that is inflation in itself. So what I wanted to really get people to understand is that inflation impacts them, and we see it on the telly. We might see an announcement that inflation has gone up by 2% in the previous year or something like that. And people might not really understand how that impacts them. Now, the official measure that you often see regarding inflation is something called CPI. And that consumer price index, it measures inflation over time. And the way they do it is they look at the price of goods in the shops, price of services. They create this fictional basket, and it's what goes in there changes over time to reflect the changes in human behavior and things that people buy. For example, digital products will be in there these days where they wouldn't have been, say, 20, 30 years ago. And that is a reflection of what people spend their money on. And so they try and keep a measure of what prices are doing. And of course, the Bank of England has a monetary policy committee that sets interest rates that is targeted at keeping that inflation rate at 2%. That's the target rate. And if they don't, they normally have to write to the Chancellor to explain why, if they're not within 1% up or down of that target rate. So inflation actually works as almost a form of stealth tax, because over time, if you have money and you do nothing with it, you put it in a shoebox or you put it under the bed, what happens? The prices in the economy of the things that you buy slowly increases. And it means the purchasing power of your money starts to fall. And therefore you become fundamentally poorer. So you're not able to buy as much stuff as you did previously. Now, if you go on the Bank of England website, there is an inflation calculator that they have that shows you the impact of inflation over time. And I'm just going to give you an example that in a space of just 5 years, if we go back just 5 years, so the calculator goes up to 2019. So if we go back to 2014, so that 5-year period till 2019, if you'd had £1,000 of product that you'd bought in 2014, that cost you £1,000. If you wanted to buy the same goods in 2019, you would have needed £1,128 to buy the same goods. That's a big increase over that period of time. And that's because inflation was around about 2.4% per annum. Now, if you go back a little bit longer, say to 10 years ago, so to the point where Money to the Masses was created, so we're going back towards 2009, £1,000 worth of goods then, you would need £1,351 today to buy the same amount of goods. And that is an incredible increase. That's over 30%. And that is inflation and the impact of compounding over time. So the inflation is growing and it's compounding. If you go back even further, then £1,000 of goods in 1990, so we're going back 30 years, you would need £2,464 today to buy the equivalent amount of stuff. So that shows you the impact of inflation and how we are all fundamentally getting poorer unless our wealth keeps pace with inflation. In fact, it needs to exceed it if you're going to get wealthier. But perhaps the even worse news for people out there is that while we look at the headline rate of inflation, which is currently just below 2%, the real rate of inflation varies from person to person. Now, I'll give you another example from my own personal life. I pay for my daughter's football team that she plays for. So you have to pay subs so she can play in her football team. Now, a year ago, that was £30 a month, which I think is quite expensive. It went up this year by £5. That's a huge increase percentage-wise. Now, if you go through all your life and you're looking at your home insurance, your car insurance, the products you buy, your food you buy, the amount that you pay and the increases on those individual products, if you add it all together, you will end up having your own personal inflation rate, which will be very different to the headline one you see on the news. And unfortunately, the BBC no longer have an inflation calculator. They used to have a personalised one where you could work out what your personal rate of inflation was. And the unfortunate news is that there are a lot of economists out there that actually believe the rate of inflation is probably 5 to 6% at least higher than the headline rate of inflation. And we're looking at it being probably near 8-9% a year. So that means that your wealth needs to grow at that rate just for you to stand still. So I want to give everybody a sort of a visual exercise. If you imagine that in life that you're on a treadmill, a really long treadmill, if you stand still on that treadmill that's in motion, you will be moving backwards. That means you're getting poorer. That's the inflation effect. If you are going to move forward, you're going to have to start to move faster. So the treadmill at the gym analogy helps you visualize the impact of inflation. You need to start running a bit faster, earning more than inflation, or your assets growing faster than inflation. And if you think about it, if the rate of inflation was at 7%, if you go back a few podcasts and I talked about key numbers, the rule of 70, you can work out how quickly things double. Using the rule of 70, if inflation was at 7%, a 7% rate means that it doubles over 10 years if it's at 7%. So you're going to need your money to be almost doubling over that period of time for you to try and keep pace with inflation. Now, again, as I say, it's very personal. It might not be as high as that for most people. But what it does, it makes you realize that as a person, you need to start thinking about inflation a little bit more. So if you have a job, if you're not getting a increase in your wage over time, so you won't necessarily get an increase every year. I get that. That's to do with recessions and everything like that. But over the extended period of time, you need your wage for the job you do to exceed the inflation rate that you pay. And if you don't, then fundamentally, you're actually getting paid less in real terms because your money can buy less stuff over time for doing the same amount of work. So if people are more aware of this headline rate, what they will then start to realize is they need to make their money work harder as well. So you have money in the bank, for example, you may need that to earn more interest than it currently is. It's a reason to start to move your money around to try and find a better rate of interest in different bank accounts. Of course, most bank accounts at the moment don't pay more than the current rate of inflation. That's unfortunate, but you can on some accounts get a little bit more if you lock your money away. But what it does emphasize to people that if you want your wealth to grow over time, if you want to get richer over time, if you want to be able to get to a point where you have more control over your life and your bills, and you're not just living more hand to mouth like most people are, then in real terms, you need to start to do something with your money. And that means trying to gain capital that can earn interest or earns a profit by investing over time. We do live in a capitalist world, and the fact is that capital earns more money really in the long term than labour does. So what we need to do is just trying to get people to realise that they need to grow their wealth at a faster rate than the inflation rate they pay if they are going to maintain their standard of living in real terms. So the message then becomes, look to move your savings around, but start to look to invest, and you need to start to try and build a pool of money that you can grow over time to try and combat inflation. You can combat inflation by trying to tackle it, stop buying so many things that are going up or becoming more expensive, find cheaper options, shop around. But you also need to try and harness inflation. So that means trying to own assets that are growing with inflation over time. And it's perhaps no coincidence that the wealthiest people that you might know or are out there own assets and they invest money. So they will invest in things like the stock market. They may invest in property. They might invest in commodities, things like gold. They will invest in businesses because a lot of wealthy people end up owning businesses. It's one of the best ways you can grow your money is to have capital that you invest in a business. So people end up being able to improve their standard of living at a faster rate than inflation erodes it. So you need to tackle that. Think about how you're going to grow it. And if anything else, it makes you realize that as a motivator, that if you are going to beat inflation and not become poorer, you need to grow your wealth. And how are you going to be able to do it? And it may be that you invest in yourself. So you start to think about maybe improving your skill sets. You can get a better job. You improve your skill set. You maybe start a new business. But more importantly, you start to put money aside every month to be able to have money that is working while you sleep. So it can actually grow at a faster pace and it can actually improve. And in time, more and more of your wealth, you will want to be moving across to that side. So you have more and more capital that is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the impact of compounding, which is going to be partly illustrated by the next piece I talk about, the chap who who retired at the age of 35. The more money that we can get working to combat inflation, that we own inflation, that we actually invest in things that are going to go up in time, putting your money in a shoebox may make you feel better, which I know there are people out there who generally do that, but it will actually make you poorer. And the final thing I want to mention on inflation is the importance of inflation when you're planning for your future when it comes to retirement. So £10,000 back in 1990, and you said to the person that they wanted £10,000 just to keep the numbers easy to understand as an income in money in those days. So they went, yeah, I like £10,000. It buys me what I need. It's 1990. It buys me the stuff I want. Now, if they are retiring today, 30 years later, so they were 30 back then, they're now 60 now. Using those figures that I spoke about earlier, you will then understand that they actually need their retirement pot to generate £24,638 a year. So they have maintained their standard of living. So they can buy the same amount or the same things that they could buy for £10,000 in 1990. They could buy the same things today. So that shows you the power of inflation. You have to plan it as part of your ultimate goal. Now, there are calculators out there. We have one. PensionBee have a very good one that's quite nice, has nice sliders that takes into account the impacts of inflation, so you can understand what you will need to save to maintain the standard of living or to achieve the standard of living that you want in retirement. But the other point I just want to mention is that when people get to retirement, and it's why you should seek financial advice, because at a point of retirement, you've got a pot of money that's got to generate an income. And what people will do is they'll focus on the now. So they'll sit there and look at their bills quite rightly, start to reduce them, what expenses they don't need, and they will look at how much they need to live on today. And they will say, look, my pot could maybe do that. It could generate 5% a year. But they've also got to realize that over time, if they have a long retirement, the cost of all those bills are going to increase. And so therefore they need the income that's generated by their pot to increase as well. So they will want their pot to increase over time to be able to generate that amount of money. But it will also probably mean that they will start to have to view their way of generating an income in retirement in a slightly different way. And it is interesting to note that one way to produce a growing income stream over time is to invest in equity income. So income funds, for example. And so that inherently has a risk to it. But what you're after is the yield that it produces, and it grows over time as dividends grow over time, as companies grow over time, as their profits grow over time. You start to ride that trend. Yes, the capital value of your pension will fluctuate, go up and down, but as long as you can build a buffer that can cope with lean periods like we might have now when it comes to dividends being reduced or cut. But as long as the dividends are maintained over time and grow, and you do the research to find those funds, then you should be able to maintain your standard of living. So the message is, we need to really grasp that inflation is really important to everybody. And if nothing else, you should realize it's a real big motivator to take action now to try and combat it. Otherwise, you are fundamentally getting poorer in real terms. And another point just to mention on property, it's a good illustration on property. So if you invest in property, that is one way that you could have an asset that grows over time. But as a property value grows, you have to realize that people look at it and go, oh, my property's doubled or gone up 50% in 15 years. And that seems like a decent rate of growth. But when I look at my house price over time, and I live in London, and you may look at numbers that may seem like that, but when you work out the annual rate of growth and the effect of compounding, it's barely 1% above inflation. But of course, I spent a lot of money on my house to be able to live in it, to improve it, to extend it when I needed to, when I had our second daughter. And of course, you take that all in the round, then fundamentally, despite the headline number of looking at the price of the house, in real terms, I've actually got poorer. So I'm just pointing that out to people, that you look at the absolute return, look at the real rate of return, and of course, look at charges. This all comes into the round, and you need to think about how are you going to grow your wealth in excess of that? And there's no one correct answer. It's a mixture of all the things that I mentioned earlier.
Good stuff. Where I struggle with, Damon, just briefly, I know we've got to move on. Inflation, for me, always seems like quite a negative word because everything's going up. But of course, in economics, inflation has to happen. It's kind of viewed as a good thing. Is it a good or a bad thing, or is it? I don't know. Am I silly to have that view?
No, it's part of economic growth. So as the economy grows, that's what happens. Inflation is part of that cycle. So you need things to go up in prices. Just basically what happens as an economy grows over time. And the Bank of England looks to have to try and control it to stop the economy overheating. So I know what you mean. It's a negative for from a personal perspective, but it's a necessary part of the economy. But then what I'm doing in this piece is flipping it on its head as well and saying to people that, yeah, you realise that this is something that exists. So can we try and ride that? And it is possible. And that is by being very deliberate and actually investing over time. If you don't, then the people who end up having a wage that doesn't increase and don't try and take advantage of it, try and invest, they are actually getting, in real terms, poorer over time. So, yeah, I think it's a valid question, Andy. I think it's a good question, in fact.
Good. So that's inflation cover. We mentioned at the start of the podcast we were going to speak about FIRE movement, financial independence, retire early. And there's a particular example of someone who's retired at 35 to travel the world and how they did it.
Yeah, so this was something that actually I pushed out on Twitter and I called it fire porn because it is really. I mean, the headline, it was on CNBC. It was a millionaire who saved 70% of his income and retired at 35. And the main part of the article was we all should live by these 6 basic principles. Now, I want to go through them because they are, firstly, they're quite insightful for people who might be interested in trying to do what this chap did. And basically what he did is he accumulated $1 million in savings by the age of 35. He did it with his partner. Yes, they had quite well-paid jobs. In fact, I think they had very well-paid jobs, but they worked hard at trying to get that amount of money. So it allowed them to be able to travel and have that financial freedom. Now, the number one thing for them was to make financial freedom the number one goal. So this is the first rule you've got to live by. Now, the reason I quite like the article, it was to give an illustration. If you think back to last week when I mentioned about the driving analogy, what this person is doing is they're using the idea of they've decided on their destination, where they want to go. And then they've reverse engineered it and then they've gone for it. But they've gone in for it in a very obviously aggressive way, which wouldn't suit everybody. But it illustrates the point of the importance of having a goal. If you have a goal, you're much more likely to succeed. And his goal was to save $1 million by the time he was 35, which isn't for everybody, but it shows that there are people out there who do it and can achieve it. Now, he mentions here, actively boost your income. So what he did is he did a lot of side hustles, which were included YouTube channels, very small amounts of money he was earning. But one of the things he said his primary source of income was his job, and he continues to work hard at it, but he managed to secure pay rises of 10, 15%, and he made himself indispensable. So he increased his wage. Now, if you go back to the piece I just did at the beginning of the podcast, the first piece, what he did is he focused on increasing his income by busting inflation. His increases in his income were much greater than inflation. So it meant that he was able to not only grow his wealth through his job by earning more money, but it meant that he was able to put more money aside to be able to invest and that grow on its own. Now, number 3, it caught my eye because resonates again with the first piece of this podcast. Invest in appreciating assets. So now he built up a lot of their wealth by investing in appreciating assets. He's put the stock market, real estate, so that's property, businesses, and relics or historic objects. Now, the last ones are things that are very specialist, but there are people out there I know who are into buying antiques and investing in them and selling them. So the point is that he, again, grasped the concept of the importance of capital in a capitalist world. It makes more money. So if you think about it, if you get a pool of money and it starts to grow, that compounding effect, if you had £1,000, he talks about his $1,000 and he got 10% growth on it in a year, it would be $1,100. That $1,100, if it grew 10% the next year, that then 10% is being applied to all the $1,100. So he gets $110 and that adds on top. So you can see this is compounding. And it's a great example of what I was trying to explain earlier. Now, the fourth part is automate. It's something I believe firmly in. When we do things on the Money MOT, it's always trying to make things easy, automate paying down credit cards, paying yourself first. They don't use that term. We like to use it over in the UK. Pay yourself first, automate. So one of the direct debit standing orders that comes out each month is to your investments or your savings. That way you ensure there's a discipline and you continue to do it. Know where your money is going. This was budgeting, effectively something that we talk about a lot on the MOT. Know where your money's going, quantify it, and that means you can control it. And don't let small expenses get out of hand. So again, it's about trying to control where your money goes. And then finally, and I mean, this is why I also quite liked it, detach yourself from things you don't need. Now, I like the piece because for people now, it resonates because of the lockdown. And now it's a phrase that I'm slowly trying to coin of the lockdown lifestyle. We all had a lockdown lifestyle where we detached from everything and it wasn't a choice. We had to. So we didn't go and down the pub, or we didn't go and spend on things that were very frivolous, or we weren't quite so caught up in the consumer world or the consumer lifestyle. And it meant that a lot of people saved a hell of a lot of money. In fact, I saw a statistic, and I can't remember the exact number, but it was a large one. 70-80% of people saved money during the lockdown. And that was because they detached themselves. And so we've had a lesson that we've all got a lockdown lifestyle that we've experienced and how we can do it if we have to. So this FIRE movement, this guy, he doesn't particularly express it as FIRE movement, but it is kind of what he does. But it's that way of being very deliberate about what you do. But what is interesting though, is there's an illustration of compounding. You don't have to be as aggressive as this guy. You don't have to say, I want $1 million to live on when I'm 35. And there is obviously $30 million when you're 35 sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money. But if you want that just to generate your income for the rest of your life, you're going to struggle, have to live a very frugal life, because if you think about it, the idea of a 4% withdrawal rate is going to be quite high. And your money won't grow over time. And what I've just talked about, inflation, by the time you get to 65, your money, if it hasn't been decreased, even if you've just managed to keep the 4% withdrawals, keep pace with them with the growth of your investment, then inflation would have made you that much poorer. So you need to be getting 4% growth plus inflation for the money to be growing over time. So it's possible, but it's going to have to be quite punchy, but it is possible. Now, the one thing that I want people to also focus on is a slightly different way of looking at this. So you might not want to retire at 35 and you might not be able to save $1 million. I mean, that is very punchy. And he had a very well-paid job. But people are out there saving money for house deposits. And so that might be 20, 30, 50 grand over a period of time. But let's just say that you had 50 grand that you managed to save up by the time you were 30. Now, that isn't outlandish. You might have £50,000. If you just invested that money, didn't add anything else to it, of course you should really do that. You need to add money to it to keep it growing. But imagine you didn't. Now, if you were able to get a return of 7% a year, so 7%, I use that because it's a very nice number to use with the rule of 70. That means after 10 years, your money will double in value if you get 7% growth. We're ignoring inflation and everything at the moment. Just focus on the 7%. Your 50 grand after 10 years will grow to 100 grand. Another 10 years after that, it will effectively double again. So that 100 grand will have gone to 200 grand. Now, if you imagine another 10 years after that, so we've now gone 10 years, 10 years, 10 years, that's 30 years, you're now 60, the money's going to have doubled again. So that's 400,000. And now the rule of 70 is just a rough estimate, because if you do the actual numbers, it's nearer 380. But what you've worked out is that if you saved money, compounding works the best on the more money you have. So that's why it's important to try and gain as much capital as you can and to start saving early and start investing as soon as you can and early, because you want to harness the impact and the power of compounding and the power of inflation and the power of economic growth, all those things. And they are much more powerful on a bigger number. If you only have a tiny pot, then this doesn't matter if your money doubles or trebles over time, you're still going to only be doing a very small amount. So there is this idea that people save more earlier. They don't have to get to the point where they have $1 million, but they could have a sizable pot much younger, and they can allow that to grow and they can keep adding to it over time. Of course, you want that 7% that I mentioned to be over inflation. Of course, the killer and the $1 million question is, well, can you get 7% per annum? Well, now the Barclays Equity Gilt Study has shown that over time, they look at 100 years, equities return 5% in real terms, so 5% above inflation on average. You're going to have big years going up, big years going down. So it's going to be a mixture, but over the long term, that's a sort of return that you could expect without really punching the lights out. So it's achievable. It's something you're going to have to be comfortable with the risk. But what I want to show people with both of these pieces is that if you're deliberate and you realize what's really going on out in the world, in the economy, it matters, then you need to harness that, and you can then hopefully at some point retire when you want or choose when you want to retire. It doesn't mean you have to retire at 35. It may be you decide to retire at 60.
Brilliant stuff. Okay, so moving on to the last piece, and we're talking about renters, and finally there's a little bit of good news, Damien.
Yeah, last year there was a letting fees ban, and that meant that landlords and estate agents couldn't charge administration fees for services and referencing and stuff like that. And it also capped the amount of holding deposits. So when you decide you find somewhere you like and you have to put down a deposit so you don't lose it, that could only be 1 week's rent, and they could only charge up front 5 weeks deposit, so 5 weeks rent as a deposit. Or it was if you had over a yearly rent over 50 grand, it could be 6 weeks. Now those rules came in. The problem was, or has been, is that people who signed contracts before that period, so before the 1st of June 2019, could still face these high fees when renewing contracts. But now obviously it's changed, so even if these fees are stated, they can't be enforced for people now, because we've gone it's a year on, we're now in June 2020. But the thing I just wanted to highlight is that the deposit cap has been extended to all tenancies. So that means that if there's somebody out there who is renting and they originally paid 6 weeks deposit when they signed a tenancy agreement and they renew, they are entitled to get a sixth of it back. So they are entitled to get 1 week's rent back. Of course, that's unless their rent is over £50,000 a year, as I said, because it's still 6 weeks rent. So the landlord or the letting agent are supposed to get in touch with renters to explain this to them and to give them a refund if it's owed to them. But I just wanted to mention it because we have a whole range of people who listen to the podcast, people who own properties, people who rent, and they may be in a situation where they did pay 6 weeks rent as a deposit and they've renewed their contract or have had it changed from a periodic tenancy to a fixed term tenancy. And it's just to mention that they should hear from the landlord or the agent to give them a refund. And of course, in this environment, I think people would quite like to have a week's rent lump sum paid back to them. So if you know somebody who it may impact, then do mention it to them. You can find out more online, of course, but there you go. Just a quick FYI. Hopefully that helps somebody, but they should automatically get this money back. But it is worth mentioning that if you aren't eligible because there's been no change to your contract, that some landlords are actually giving their tenants a refund on that 1 week's rent anyway. So it's worth asking.
So that is it for this week. If you want to get in touch with Damien, you can do so. It's Damien at moneytothemasses.com. Twitter, it's at moneytothemasses with the number 2. Get involved on our Facebook group. It's facebook.com/groups/money to the masses. And of course, we've got a YouTube channel. And also, we don't often mention it, and we really should mention it every week. Don't forget to sign up to the Money to the Masses newsletter if you haven't already. Just Google the words Money to the Masses newsletter. The page will come up and you just pop your email address in there. And every Sunday at 10 o'clock, without fail, you'll get the latest financial news and stories, property, all the top stories from the top Sunday newspapers delivered straight to your inbox. And you won't even have to hunt around it, and it'll be there for you. And we'll also put our articles and links in there as well. Damien, I think that's it, isn't it?
That is it this week, Andy. So until next time, let's hope. And one day we'll get Lola on the podcast, get her barking. Is she a yappy dog, Andy?
She's starting to show signs. So yeah, I'm sure she'll be on the podcast before long. Until next time.
Until next time.